What if the world we still argue with, dream in, and measure ourselves against, was first imagined by a scattering of people living on rocky hills and narrow shores, where the land itself refused to make them one nation, and where the sea did more talking than any king? Long before there were marble ruins bleached white by the sun, before the word democracy was carved onto any stone, there were only villages of farmers and fishermen looking out at a bright, difficult sea, wondering how to survive another season. Tonight, we will follow the long, quiet story of ancient Greece, from those first small settlements on the edge of the water, through the age of gods and temples, through the rise of cities that could not agree on anything except that they were Greek, through wars that emptied whole generations, and into the slow twilight when Greek voices spoke on long after Greek power had faded. This is not a story of one crown or one capital. It is the story of many small worlds learning to speak to one another, and of ideas that outlived every wall that ever tried to hold them. So let the room grow soft around you. Lower the lights, rest your head, and let your breathing slow. There is no need to remember any of the names or dates that drift by tonight. They will move past you gently, like ships seen far out on a calm evening, and you may simply watch them pass. If you enjoy these slow walks through the old world, you are welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need another quiet night among ancient stones. And now, with the fire low and the night settling in, let us go back to the beginning, to a land shaped by water and stone. Greece is not a generous country to farmers. If you could stand on one of its high ridges in the earliest days and look outward, you would see mountains folding into mountains, valleys cupped between them like the palms of hands, and everywhere the sea reaching inland with long silver fingers. The land is broken into small pieces, and each piece is separated from the next by ridges too steep for easy travel and by water that could be friend or enemy depending on the wind. This shattered geography would shape everything that came after. Because no single valley could easily rule the others, the Greeks never became one empire under one distant throne the way the peoples of the great river plains did. Instead, they became a scattering of small, stubborn communities, each convinced of its own importance, each looking out at the same bright horizon. The soil was thin and rocky, better suited to olives and grapes than to fields of grain. The rains came in winter and vanished in the long dry summers, so that the hills turned gold and brittle under a hard sun. From this land the early Greeks learned patience and thrift. They pressed oil from their olives and stored it in tall clay jars. They grew vines on terrace slopes and made wine that they mixed with water. They kept goats and sheep on the higher ground, and they fished the sheltered bays. And always, always they looked to the sea, because the sea was the only wide road they had. To go from one part of Greece to another, it was often easier to sail than to climb. So the Greeks became sailors almost before they became anything else, and the smell of salt and tar and drying nets became part of who they were. Long before the age of the famous cities, this land already held old memories of grandeur. To understand what came later, we have to step back into a time so distant that even the ancient Greeks themselves half remembered it as legend. On the island of Crete, in the deep past of the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years ago, there rose a people whom later scholars would call the Minoans, after the legendary King Minos. They built sprawling palaces, the greatest at a place called Knossos, with winding corridors, painted walls, and great storerooms full of oil and grain. On their walls, they painted leaping dolphins, slender young people, and a strange and thrilling ritual in which acrobats seemed to vault over the horns of charging bulls. They wrote in a script we still cannot fully read, and they traded across the Eastern Sea, sending their goods to Egypt and beyond. For a long while they seemed to have lived without heavy fortifications, as though the sea itself were their wall. Then, on the mainland, another people rose, whom we call the Mycenaeans, after their fortress, city of Mycenae with its great stone gate crowned by two carved lions facing one another across a pillar. These were harder, more warlike people. Their kings were buried with masks of beaten gold and bronze swords laid beside them. They built thick walls of stone so massive that later Greeks, unable to imagine mortal hands lifting them, said giants must have done the work. The Mycenaeans traded, raided, and eventually seemed to have taken over the world of Crete as Minoan power faded. And it is from the dim memory of these Bronze Age kings that the later Greeks drew their greatest stories. The tales of a war fought across the sea against the city of Troy, of proud Agamemnon and swift Achilles, of long journeys home across an angry ocean. Whether any real war lies behind those stories, historians still debate, and the sources are not always clear. What seems likely is that the poems remembered, in a golden haze, a genuine age of palaces and warlords that had already vanished by the time the poems were sung. For that world did vanish. Around 3,200 years ago, across the whole eastern Mediterranean, something went wrong. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade routes fell silent, and whole kingdoms disappeared within a few generations. Historians still argue about the causes, pointing to drought, earthquakes, internal revolt, moving peoples, and the collapse of fragile trade networks that had bound the region together. Whatever the truth, the great Bronze Age world came apart, and Greece slipped into what later ages would call a dark age. The art of writing was forgotten. The grand palaces crumbled. Populations shrank, and villages grew small and poor. For several centuries the Greeks lived quietly, herding and farming, telling old stories by their fires, remembering a greatness they could no longer build. And yet those quiet centuries were not empty. Beneath the poverty, something new was slowly forming. In small communities where no god-king ruled from a painted palace, people had to work out among themselves how to share land, settle quarrels, and defend their homes. Councils of elders met, warriors of roughly equal standing spoke their minds. The habit of talking things through, of arguing openly rather than simply obeying, put down deep roots in the dark. Nobody planned it. It grew, as such things grow, out of necessity in the shape of the land, in valleys too small for tyrants and too proud for masters. Then, gradually, the light began to return. To trace how, we have to move forward a few centuries into a time of quiet renewal. The Greeks learned writing again, but this time in a new way. From the Phoenicians, the great traders of the eastern coast, they borrowed an alphabet and reshaped it, adding signs for vowels until they had a script that could capture the flow of ordinary speech. With that alphabet they wrote down, at last, the old songs that had been passed from voice to voice for generations. And so we come to the poems we call the Iliad and the Odyssey, associated with the name of Homer. Though whether Homer was one poet or many, or a name given to a long tradition, historians still cannot say for certain. What matters is that these poems became the shared inheritance of every Greek, from the wealthiest lord to the poorest fisherman. Children learned them. Grown men quoted them. In a land with no single ruler and no single temple, these stories became a kind of common homeland of the mind, a place all Greeks could stand together even when they agreed on nothing else. As the population grew again, the small settlements began to organize themselves into a new kind of community that would define Greek life for centuries. This was the polis, usually translated as city-state, though it was really something more intimate than a city and smaller than a state. A polis was a town and the farmland around it, bound together by shared gods, shared ancestors, shared law, and a fierce sense of belonging. Each polis governed itself. Each had its own coins, its own festivals, its own particular character. Athens and Sparta, Corinth and Thebes, and hundreds of smaller ones scattered across the mainland, the islands and distant coasts. Each thought of itself as a little world entire. A man was not simply Greek in some vague sense. He was an Athenian or a Corinthian or a Theban, and to be exiled from one's polis was to lose almost everything that made life meaningful. Life inside these early communities moved to the rhythm of the farming year and the turning of religious festivals. In the gray light before dawn, a farmer would rise, eat a little bread dipped in wine or oil, and walk out to his fields with his tools over his shoulder. Women rose too, grinding grain into flour with heavy stones, tending the hearth, weaving cloth on upright looms, managing a household economy that was the quiet foundation of everything. Children carried water, watched the goats, and learned by watching. In the town center lay the agora, an open space that was market and meeting ground at once, where men gathered to trade, to gossip, to argue politics, and to hear the news carried in by travelers and sailors. Around the edges rose workshops where potters shaped clay, smiths hammered bronze, and stonecutters chipped at blocks that would one day become temples. And above the town, on the highest defensible hill, stood the sacred ground, the place the Greeks called the Acropolis, meaning simply the high city. Here they built their temples and set up their altars, for the gods were woven into every hour of Greek life. To understand these people, we have to spend a little while among their gods, for the Greeks did not keep religion in a separate corner of existence. Their gods were everywhere, in the storm and the harvest, in the sea and the hearth fire, in love and in war, and in the making of wine. The Greeks imagined their gods as a great quarrelsome family living high on the cloud-wrapped peak of Mount Olympus, the tallest mountain in their land. At their head sat Zeus, lord of the sky and the thunderbolt, a ruler as prone to anger and desire as any human king. Beside him ruled his wife Hera, guardian of marriage, watchful and often wronged. There was gray-eyed Athena, born, so the stories said, from the very head of Zeus, goddess of wisdom, of skilled craft, and of the disciplined side of war. There was Poseidon, who shook the earth and ruled the sea that the Greeks both loved and feared. There was bright Apollo, god of light, music, prophecy, and healing, whose oracle at Delphi would come to speak for the will of heaven itself. There was Aphrodite of desire, Ares of raw battle, Hermes the swift messenger and guide of travelers, Demeter of the grain, and many more, down to the small spirits of a particular spring or grove. These gods were not distant, perfect beings demanding pure devotion. They were powerful, immortal, and dangerous, but they loved, schemed, laughed, and took revenge much as people did. The Greeks did not so much worship them out of love as honor them out of respect and a healthy sense of caution. To keep the gods content, a family poured a little wine on the ground before drinking, or laid the first portion of a meal on the household altar. A city held great public festivals with processions, songs, and the sacrifice of animals, whose meat was then roasted and shared among the people, so that a religious rite was also a communal feast. There was little of what we might call preaching or personal salvation. Instead, there was a sense that human beings lived their brief lives beneath watchful powers, that pride could invite ruin, and that wisdom lay in knowing the limits set for mortals. Nowhere was this feeling stronger than at the sanctuary of Delphi, perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the Greeks believed the very center of the world could be found, marked by a sacred stone. There a priestess known as the Pythia, seated over a cleft in the rock, spoke words believed to come from Apollo himself. Cities and kings sent messengers to Delphi before great decisions, and the answers she gave were often mysterious, open to more than one meaning. Carved near the temple were words that captured the whole spirit of Greek religion and Greek thought together: know yourself, and nothing in excess. In those few words lay a lifetime of quiet wisdom, a reminder that human beings are small, that pride is dangerous, and that the wise soul seeks balance rather than glory. As the centuries turned and the Greek world grew more crowded, the small valleys could no longer feed all their people. And so began a great scattering across the sea, a movement historians call colonization. Groups of citizens, sometimes the younger sons who would inherit no land, sometimes those on the losing side of a local quarrel, gathered under a chosen leader, consulted the oracle at Delphi for a blessing, and sailed out to found new communities on distant shores. They planted Greek towns along the coasts of what is now Turkey, around the shores of the Black Sea, along the coasts of North Africa, in Sicily and southern Italy, and as far west as the coast of France and Spain. Each new settlement kept the customs of its mother city, honored the same gods, and carried the same language and stories, so that by degrees a common Greek culture spread all around the shores of the Middle Sea. A Greek sailor could put in at a strange harbor 1,000 miles from home and still find familiar temples, familiar words, familiar wine mixed in the familiar way. This wide scattering knit the Greeks together even as it spread them apart. Ideas, goods, and inventions traveled along the sea lanes with the ships. From the peoples of the East, the Greeks learned much, including, most importantly, the use of coined money, small stamped pieces of metal that made trade simpler and wealth more portable. Markets grew busier. A new class of merchants and craftsmen arose in the cities, men who were not great landowners but who could grow rich through trade and skill. And as this new wealth spread, the old order in which a handful of noble families ran everything began to strain and crack. Ordinary men who fought for their city and paid for their own armor began to feel that they, too, deserved a voice in how the city was run. And so quietly, across many cities and many decades, the long argument over who should hold power began. As the centuries turned and the Greek world grew more crowded, the small valleys could no longer feed all their people, and so began a great scattering across the sea, a movement historians call colonization. Groups of citizens, sometimes the younger sons who would inherit no land, sometimes those on the losing side of a local quarrel, gathered under a chosen leader, consulted the oracle at Delphi for a blessing, and sailed out to found new communities on distant shores. They planted Greek towns along the coasts of what is now Turkey, around the shores of the Black Sea, along the coasts of North Africa, in Sicily and southern Italy, and as far west as the coast of France and Spain. Each new settlement kept the customs of its mother city, honored the same gods, and carried the same language and stories, so that by degrees a common Greek culture spread all around the shores of the Middle Sea. A Greek sailor could put in at a strange harbor 1,000 miles from home and still find familiar temples, familiar words, familiar wine mixed in the familiar way. This wide scattering knit the Greeks together even as it spread them apart. Ideas, goods, and inventions traveled along the sea lanes with the ships. From the peoples of the East, the Greeks learned much, including, most importantly, the use of coined money, small stamped pieces of metal that made trade simpler and wealth more portable. Markets grew busier. A new class of merchants and craftsmen arose in the cities, men who were not great landowners but who could grow rich through trade and skill. And as this new wealth spread, the old order in which a handful of noble families ran everything began to strain and crack. Ordinary men who fought for their city and paid for their own armor began to feel that they, too, deserved a voice in how the city was run. And so, quietly, across many cities and many decades, the long argument over who should hold power began. Now let us cross the mountains and travel north and east to a very different city. Built around a great rock rising from a plain not far from the sea, this was Athens, where Sparta turned inward and looked to the land. Athens turned outward and looked to the water. Where Sparta prized silence and obedience, Athens came to prize speech and argument. Where Sparta feared change, Athens, over the course of many restless generations, invented one of the most daring political experiments the world has ever seen. The road to that experiment was long and troubled. Like most Greek cities, Athens had once been ruled by noble families who owned the best land and controlled the law. As trade grew and hard times came, many ordinary farmers fell into debt, and under the harsh customs of the day, a man who could not pay might lose not only his land, but his very freedom, sold into slavery to satisfy what he owed. Anger built in the countryside. The city stood on the edge of open conflict between the few who had much and the many who had little. It was into this dangerous moment, around the beginning of the 6th century before our era, that the Athenians turned to a man named Solon, remembered as one of the wisest of the Greeks, and gave him the power to reform their laws. Solon walked a careful line. He canceled the crushing debts that were destroying the poor and forbade the practice of enslaving citizens for debt, freeing those who had been sold. Yet he did not seize the land of the rich and give it to the poor, as some had hoped, nor did he overturn the whole order of society. He reorganized the citizens into classes based on their wealth and their ability to serve the city. and he opened the assembly, the gathering of citizens, to a wider body of men. He gave ordinary Athenians the right to appeal to a court of their fellow citizens. His reforms satisfied neither the rich nor the poor completely, and afterward, tradition says, he left Athens to travel for years so that he would not be forced to keep changing what he had made, but he had planted something. He had established the idea that the law belonged to the whole community, not merely to the powerful, and that even the humble citizen had rights the mighty must respect. The road did not run smooth after Solon. Athens fell for a time under the rule of a single strong man, a type the Greeks called a tyrant, though the word did not then carry all the darkness it carries now. It meant simply one who had seized power outside the law, and some tyrants ruled well, beautifying their cities and favoring the common people against the old nobility. But the Athenians grew weary of one-man rule, and near the end of that century, after struggle and bloodshed, a leader named Cleisthenes carried through the reforms that would truly give birth to what we now call democracy. A word built from Greek roots meaning simply the power of the people. Cleisthenes reorganized the citizens so that old loyalties to noble families and local regions were broken up and mixed together, binding men into new groups that cut across the ancient divisions. He strengthened the assembly, where every adult male citizen had the right to attend, to speak, and to vote directly on the laws and policies of the city. There were no professional politicians ruling from above. Ordinary citizens themselves debated whether to go to war, how to spend the city's money, and what laws to pass. Many public officials were chosen not by election but by lot, drawn at random, on the principle that any citizen was fit to serve and that power should not rest too long in the same hands. It was a bold and startling idea that ordinary men, farmers and potters and sailors, should govern themselves. It was also, we must be honest, a limited democracy, for women had no political voice, and the city, like all Greek cities, rested in part upon the labor of enslaved people who had no rights at all. The beauty of the idea and the shadow beneath it must be held together if we are to see the past clearly. Yet even with all its limits, something new had entered the world. The notion that free men could rule themselves through open argument, rather than through the will of a master. While these quiet revolutions in how to live were unfolding within the Greek cities, far to the east a shadow was gathering that would soon force all the quarrelsome Greeks to remember, however briefly, that they were one people. To understand it, we have to lift our eyes from the small valleys of Greece and look toward the rising sun, to the vast lands beyond the sea, where the greatest empire the world had yet known was spreading its power ever wider. This was the empire of Persia, ruled by a line of great kings from their splendid capitals in the highlands of the east. The Persian kings ruled over more lands and more peoples than any before them, from the borders of India in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean in the west, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the north. Their roads ran for thousands of miles. Their royal messengers carried word across the empire with astonishing speed, and their armies drew soldiers from dozens of nations. To the great king on his distant throne, the little Greek cities on the far western edge of his world must have seemed a minor matter, a scattering of stubborn towns quarreling among themselves at the end of the map. The trouble began among the Greek cities that lay along the coast of Asia, close to Persian power, who had come under the rule of the great king. Chafing under foreign control, these cities rose in revolt, and Athens, feeling a bond with its distant kin, sent ships to help them. The revolt was crushed, but the great king had not forgotten that a small city across the sea had dared to send aid against him. And so, in the first decades of the 5th century before our era, Persia turned its enormous strength toward the Greek mainland, resolved to punish the cities that had defied it, and to fold their little world into the vast body of the empire. The first great blow fell near a plain by the sea called Marathon, not far from Athens. A Persian force landed there, expecting little resistance. The Athenians, with only a small number of allies, marched out to meet them, badly outnumbered and standing almost alone. What happened on that plain the Greeks would remember forever. The Athenian foot soldiers, in their heavy armor and tight formation, charged across the open ground and broke the Persian line, driving the invaders back to their ships. Tradition tells of a runner sent from the battlefield to carry the news of victory to the anxious city. And though the details grew in the telling, the memory of that long run survives in the word marathon to this day. Against all expectation, the small free city had thrown back the servants of the greatest king on earth. To the Greeks it seemed that free men fighting for their own homes could stand against the vast levies of an empire, and that heaven itself favored those who governed themselves. But the great king was not so easily turned aside, and so the story gathers itself for a greater trial, one that would test whether the scattered Greek cities could set aside their endless rivalries long enough to survive at all. Let us rest here a moment, in the quiet before that storm, and let the mind drift over the world we have entered. Picture the Greek lands on a warm night in that distant age. In the small cities, the lamps are being put out one by one. Farmers sleep in stone houses with earthen floors, tired from the day's work in the olive groves. In the harbors, ships rock gently at anchor, their sails furled, the water lapping softly against their hulls. On the high Acropolis of Athens, the early temples stand dark against the stars, and the night watchmen pace slowly along the walls. Somewhere a dog barks and falls silent. The gods, if they are watching, keep their own counsel, and out beyond the eastern horizon, unseen in the darkness, the great host of Persia is gathering itself for a return. But that is a story for the hours ahead. For now the Greek world sleeps, small and brave and unaware, beneath the same stars that have watched over it since the days of the giants and the golden masks. When the Persians came again, some 10 years after Marathon, they came not as a raiding force, but as an invasion meant to end the matter forever. The new great king gathered an army from across his empire, a host so large that later Greek writers strained for numbers to describe it, and led it himself toward Greece, building a bridge of boats across the narrow strait that divided Asia from Europe and cutting a canal through a headland so that his fleet might pass in safety. The whole weight of the East was moving west. Faced with this, the ever-divided Greek cities did something they almost never managed to do. Many of them, though by no means all, set aside their quarrels and joined together in a common defense, with warlike Sparta taking the lead on land and seafaring Athens upon the water. Their first stand came at a narrow pass in the mountains of the north, where the road ran in a slender ribbon between the heights and the sea, a place called Thermopylae, the gates of fire, named for the hot springs nearby. There a small Greek force, with a body of Spartans at its heart under their king Leonidas, held the pass against the vast Persian army. For days the narrow ground favored the defenders, for the great numbers of the Persians could not be brought to bear in so tight a space, and the heavily armored Greeks held their line. In the end, the Persians found a mountain path around the pass, guided by a local man who betrayed his own people, and the defenders were surrounded. Leonidas sent away most of the allied troops to fight another day, but he and his Spartans, along with some who chose to stay beside them, remained to hold the pass to the last. They died there, all of them, buying time with their lives. Over their grave, the Greeks later set a simple stone that told passers-by to carry word to Sparta that here its sons lay dead, obedient to their city's laws. The pass was lost, but the memory of that stand became, for the Greeks, and for the ages that followed, an enduring image of the courage of free men who would rather die than yield. The Persians swept south and took Athens itself. The Athenians, on the advice of a clever leader named Themistocles, had made a hard and frightening choice. Rather than try to defend their city, they abandoned it, sending their women and children to safety and putting their trust in their fleet, for the oracle at Delphi had spoken darkly of a wooden wall that alone would save them, and Themistocles had persuaded them that the wooden wall meant their ships. The Persians burned the temples on the sacred rock, and the Athenians watched the smoke rise over their homes from the decks of their vessels. It must have seemed the end of everything, yet Themistocles had laid a trap. He lured the great Persian fleet into the narrow strait of water by the island of Salamis, where the sea was too tight for the huge Persian numbers to maneuver. There, in the crowded channel, the smaller, nimbler Greek ships turned upon the crowded enemy and shattered them. The great king, who had set up a throne on the shore to watch his expected triumph, instead watched his fleet destroyed before his eyes. With his navy broken and the season turning, the great king withdrew to his empire, leaving behind a large army to finish the war the next year. But that army too was defeated, on land at a place called Plataea, where the combined Greek forces, with the Spartans again at the fore, broke the Persian host in the largest battle the Greek world had yet seen. And so, against all likelihood, the little cities on the edge of the map had turned back the greatest empire on earth, not once but again and again. The wave had broken and rolled back. Greece was free. It is hard for us, so far away in time, to feel what that deliverance meant to the people who lived through it. They had stared into the darkness of conquest and had not been swallowed. Many of them believed the gods had saved them, and that free men had proven their worth against the servants of a king. A great confidence rose among them, and nowhere more than in Athens, which had lost its city and won it back, and which now stood as the champion of the sea. Out of that confidence, and out of the wealth and pride that victory brought, would come one of the most brilliant flowerings of human achievement the world has known. But it would also come, as such things so often do, with a shadow, and with the seeds of a new and terrible conflict already sprouting in the ruins of the old. For the moment, though, let us stay in the light. After the Persian Wars, the Greek cities that had fought together and now feared a Persian return banded into an alliance to keep watch on the sea and to carry the war to Persian shores. Athens, with its great fleet and its restless energy, naturally took the lead. The allied cities contributed ships, or more often, money to a common treasury, and Athens used that combined strength to guard the seas and free more Greek cities from Persian control. But over the years, the alliance quietly changed its nature. What had begun as a partnership of free cities slowly became an empire ruled from Athens. The treasury was moved to Athens itself. Cities that tried to leave the alliance found that they could not, for Athenian ships would arrive to compel them to stay. The tribute meant for defense against Persia began to flow into the beautification and enrichment of Athens. The champion of Greek freedom had become, to many of its allies, a master they had not chosen. This is the shadow beneath the Golden Age, and we must hold it in mind even as we admire the brightness of what that age produced. For it was with this imperial wealth, and under the guidance of a leader named Pericles, that Athens entered its most dazzling years. Pericles was a man of noble birth, cool and reserved in manner, a powerful speaker who led Athens not as a king but as the most trusted voice in its democracy, re-elected year after year to high command because the citizens chose to follow him. Under his guidance, Athens deepened its democracy still further, even paying poorer citizens for their service on juries and in office so that a lack of wealth would not keep a man from taking part in ruling his city. And under his guidance, Athens rebuilt the temples the Persians had burned, turning the tribute of empire into stone and marble of a beauty that still takes the breath away. On the sacred rock of the Acropolis, rising above the city, the Athenians raised a new temple to their patron goddess, Athena, the temple we call the Parthenon. Its builders shaped it with such subtle skill that its lines, which seem perfectly straight, are in truth gently curved, so that to the eye the whole great structure appears more graceful and alive than mere straight lines could ever be. Its columns swelled slightly at the middle, its floor rose faintly toward the center, every measurement adjusted by the practiced eye of its makers to please the human sense of harmony. Inside stood a towering statue of the goddess adorned with gold and ivory, and around the building ran a carved band showing the great festival procession in which the whole city honored her. To climb to the Acropolis on a festival day, to pass through its grand gateway and see the temples gleaming in the sun, was to feel the confidence of a city that believed itself favored by heaven and equal to any glory. Yet the true glory of Athens in these years was not only in its stones, it was in its minds. In the crowded, argumentative, restless life of the democratic city, where citizens debated everything in the open air, the human spirit reached out in every direction at once. In the great open-air theaters cut into the hillsides, where thousands gathered beneath the sky, the Athenians created the art of drama. The tragic playwrights, remembered by such names as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, wrote plays that took the old myths of gods and heroes and used them to explore the deepest and most painful questions of human life. What do we owe to our families, to our cities, to the gods? What happens when duties collide and there is no path without sorrow? How should a proud soul bear suffering it did not deserve? These plays were not mere entertainment. They were performed at religious festivals, watched by the whole city together, and they asked the audience to feel pity and fear and to come away, perhaps, a little wiser about the weight of being human. Alongside the tragedies, the comic playwrights, chief among them Aristophanes, mocked the powerful, made fun of the fashions of the day, and reminded even the greatest men that in a free city no one was beyond laughter. And in the same streets, a new way of thinking was taking shape, a way of questioning that would echo down all the centuries to come. This was philosophy, the love of wisdom, the attempt to understand the world and human life through reason and patient argument, rather than through myth alone. Earlier thinkers, scattered across the Greek world, had already begun to ask bold questions. What is everything made of? Is there some single underlying substance from which all things come? Does the world change, or is change an illusion? They looked at the sky, the sea, and the earth, and sought explanations in nature itself, rather than in the whims of the gods, and in doing so they took the first steps on the long road toward what we now call science. But it was in Athens that this questioning turned most sharply upon human life itself. And here we come to one of the most memorable figures in all of history, a stonemason's son named Socrates. Socrates wrote nothing down, and much of what we know of him comes through the writings of his followers, so that historians still debate exactly where the real man ends and the portrait drawn by his admirers begins. What seems clear is that he wandered the streets and marketplaces of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen in conversation, asking simple-seeming questions that turned out to be very hard to answer. What is justice? What is courage? What is the good life? Again and again he showed that people who thought they knew the answers did not really know them at all, and he claimed that his own wisdom, if he had any, lay only in knowing how much he did not know. He believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, that human beings should above all care for the goodness of their souls, and that it was better to suffer wrong than to do it. Socrates made many enemies with his relentless questioning, for he embarrassed the powerful and unsettled the comfortable. In time, after Athens had fallen on hard days, he was brought to trial by his fellow citizens on charges of corrupting the young and failing to honor the city's gods. A jury of ordinary Athenians condemned him to death, and he died by drinking a cup of poison, calm to the end, discussing the fate of the soul with his friends as the coldness rose through his body. His death is one of the quiet tragedies of the ancient world. For the very city that had invented free and open argument put to death the man who argued most freely of all. Yet his memory could not be killed. His pupil Plato carried his teacher's spirit forward in written dialogues of great beauty and depth, founded a school called the Academy, and set down ideas about justice, the soul, and the nature of reality that thinkers would wrestle with for more than 2,000 years. And Plato's own greatest pupil, Aristotle, would go still further, studying everything under the sun, from the movements of the stars to the parts of animals, from the workings of government to the nature of a good life, laying foundations for whole fields of knowledge that endure to this day. From the streets of one small city, in the space of a few generations, came a way of asking questions that the world has never stopped asking, and so the story moves quietly forward. And we must turn from the light of that golden age to the shadow that had been growing beneath it all along. For while Athens dazzled the world with its art and its thought, the other cities of Greece watched its growing power with mounting unease, and none more than Sparta. Here were two ways of being human that could hardly have been more different. Athens, open, restless, democratic, mistress of the sea, forever reaching outward. Sparta, closed, disciplined, ruled by its warriors, mistress of the land, suspicious of all change. For years an uneasy peace had held between them, but the fear each felt of the other grew heavier with time. Athens, it seemed to Sparta and its allies, was reaching too far, gathering too much, threatening to swallow the freedom of the whole Greek world. And so, In the second half of the 5th century, before our era, the long dread finally broke into open war, a war between Athens and its empire on one side and Sparta and its allies on the other, a war that would drag on, with pauses and renewals, for nearly a generation, and that the Greeks themselves would remember as a wound from which their world never fully healed. We are fortunate, in a sad way, that this terrible conflict found its historian in a man named Thucydides, an Athenian who lived through it, who served as a commander, who was exiled for a failure in the field, and who spent his years of exile writing an account of the war with a cold, clear, unflinching eye. He did not fill his history with the doings of the gods or with pleasing legends. He tried instead to understand why men do what they do, why cities go to war, how fear and pride and self-interest drive human affairs, and how power corrupts even those who begin with good intentions. His work is one of the first attempts to write history as the search for truth about human nature, and much of what we know of these dark years comes through his careful, sorrowful pages. The war ground on, year after year, in a grinding pattern that neither side could easily break. Sparta was supreme on land and could march into the fields around Athens each year, burning the crops and cutting down the olive trees, some of which had taken generations to grow. Athens, supreme at sea, brought its rural people inside the city walls and drew its food and wealth from across its maritime empire, striking at Spartan allies from the water. Neither could quite reach the heart of the other, and into this deadlock came a disaster no one had planned for. In the crowded city, with its population swollen by refugees from the countryside packed together within the walls, a terrible sickness broke out. A plague swept through Athens, killing a great part of its people in a short and dreadful time. The historian who survived it described how the sick suffered, how the ordered life of the city broke down under the weight of so much death, how men who saw others dying all around them began to lose their fear of the law and the gods alike, snatching at pleasure while they could. Among the countless dead was Pericles himself, the guiding hand of Athens, and without him the city's leadership passed to lesser men, more reckless, more given to flattering the passions of the crowd. We should pause here to remember that behind the movements of fleets and armies, this war was lived day by ordinary people whose names we will never know. A farmer watched from the city walls as his family's olive trees, the patient work of grandfathers, were cut down by enemy soldiers. A mother in the crowded city nursed her children through the fever and buried them one by one. A young man who had grown up hearing the glorious tales of Marathon and Salamis found himself sailing off to fight fellow Greeks in a war without end. Sailors rowed until their hands bled. Merchants saw their trade wither. Children grew up knowing nothing but war. This is the true face of that long conflict, not the strategies on a map, but the slow erosion of ordinary happiness across a whole generation, the quiet grief that settled over the Greek world like dust. The most fateful moment of the war came when Athens, its confidence swollen and its judgment clouded, launched a vast expedition far across the sea to the island of Sicily, hoping to conquer the rich Greek city of Syracuse and add its wealth and grain to the Athenian empire. It was a gamble of enormous ambition, and it ended in catastrophe. The great fleet and army that Athens sent were trapped, defeated, and destroyed almost to the last man. The survivors driven into captivity in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where many died of hunger and thirst and heat. It was a blow from which Athens never truly recovered. Its treasure was spent, its fleet shattered, its bravest lost far from home. Yet astonishingly, the wounded city fought on for years more, rebuilding its fleet, refusing to yield, until at last, with Persian gold now flowing to its enemies and its navy finally destroyed, Athens was starved into surrender. Its long walls were pulled down to the sound of flute music. Its empire dissolved, its democracy briefly overthrown. The city that had thrown back the Persians and taught the world to think and to build had been brought low, not by any foreign king, but by fellow Greeks and by its own overreaching pride. And here we find one of the quiet lessons that runs through the whole story of ancient Greece. A lesson the Greeks themselves saw clearly and carved above their holiest shrine. Nothing in excess. The same energy and confidence that had raised the Parthenon and given birth to philosophy had also driven Athens to grasp for more than it could hold, until its reach exceeded its strength and it fell. The Greeks had a word for that fatal pride that overreaches its proper bounds and invites ruin. They called it hubris, and they saw it at work everywhere, in their myths, in their tragedies, and now in the fate of their greatest city. It is a lesson the ages have never quite learned, and perhaps never will. Let us pause once more, and let the night settle over this weary world. The great war is over. Athens has fallen, though it will rise again, humbled and changed. Across Greece the fields lie scarred, the families lie thinned, and a deep exhaustion has settled into the bones of the people. On a quiet evening in one of these cities, an old man who remembers the glory of the Golden Age sits in his doorway, watching the last light fade over rooftops he has known all his life. He remembers the temples going up when he was young, the plays in the great theater, the confident talk in the marketplace of a city that seemed to stand at the summit of the world. Now much of that is gone or dimmed, and he does not know what the years ahead will bring. But the stars are coming out, one by one over the old rock of the Acropolis, and the temples still stand against the sky, and somewhere a young child is learning the verses of Homer, just as he did long ago. The world turns, and grief and beauty go on together, and the night is calm. The years that followed the Great War were restless and uneasy, and they did not bring the peace that so many had longed for. Sparta had won, but victory sat heavily upon it. For Sparta was a city built for war and not for rule, and it proved a clumsy and often harsh master over the cities it now dominated. Those who had cheered the fall of Athens soon found that trading one overlord for another had gained them little. Across Greece, the same weary pattern repeated itself. One city would rise for a while and reach for leadership over the others, and then another would pull it down, and no lasting order could be found. For a surprising span of years, the city of Thebes, long overshadowed by its greater neighbors, rose to the height of power, guided by a general of rare gifts named Epaminondas, who broke the old belief that Spartan soldiers could not be beaten in open battle. He defeated them on the field through a bold new arrangement of his forces, and then he struck at the very root of Spartan strength by freeing the unfree population whose labor had fed the Spartan warriors for generations. Deprived of that hidden foundation, Sparta never fully recovered its old might. Yet Thebes too could not hold what it had won, and when Epaminondas fell in battle, the brief brightness of Theban power faded with him. And so the wheel of Greek politics turned on, city rising against city, alliances forming and dissolving like clouds, the strength of a brilliant people spending itself in quarrels among brothers. To understand what came next, we have to draw back from the tangle of these small wars and see the deeper truth beneath them. The Greek cities, for all their genius, could never learn to live together. The very independence that made each of them proud and free also kept them divided and weak, and no bond of common nationhood ever grew strong enough to hold them as one. While they exhausted themselves in bitter rivalries, a new power was quietly growing on their northern edge. In a land the southern Greeks had long looked down upon as rough and half-civilized. That land was Macedon, and out of it would come a father and a son who would reshape the world. To the polished citizens of Athens and Thebes, the Macedonians seemed a coarse and rustic folk, a people of horsemen and mountaineers ruled by kings in the old way, speaking a form of Greek that the southerners could barely follow, more given to feasting and hunting than to poetry and philosophy. Yet their kings claimed descent from the ancient heroes, worshipped the same gods, and gazed with longing toward the dazzling culture of the south. When the throne passed to a king named Philip, Macedon found in him a ruler of extraordinary cunning, energy, and vision, a man who would forge his loose and threatened kingdom into the most formidable power the Greek world had ever known. As a young man, Philip had spent time as a hostage in Thebes during the very years of its military glory, and there he had studied the arts of war under masters. When he came to a weak and endangered throne, he set about remaking his kingdom's army from the ground up. He drilled his foot soldiers into a fearsome new formation, arming them with pikes far longer than ordinary spears, so that a bristling hedge of iron points projected from the front ranks, a wall of blades that no enemy could easily break. He joined this infantry to a powerful cavalry drawn from the Macedonian nobles, and he trained his whole army to move and fight together with a discipline that the quarreling southern cities could never match. He was patient and shrewd as well, as willing to win through bribery, marriage, and false promises as through the sword. City by city, alliance by alliance, he extended his power southward, while the Greek cities, absorbed in their old feuds, failed to unite against him until too late. In Athens, one man saw the danger clearly and cried out against it. A great orator named Demosthenes, who poured out his eloquence trying to rouse his fellow citizens to resist the rising northern king before their freedom was lost. His speeches against Philip are remembered still as models of passionate persuasion, burning with warning and urgency. But warnings are easily given and hard to heed, and the Athenians, comfortable and divided, stirred themselves too slowly. When at last a Greek alliance took the field against Philip at a place called Chaeronea, the Macedonian army, with Philip's young son fighting among the commanders, shattered the combined Greek forces. On that field the old independence of the Greek cities came, in truth, to an end. Philip did not destroy them, for he wanted their strength for a far greater purpose. Instead, he bound them into a league under his own leadership, and unveiled the grand design that had long been forming in his mind. He would lead the united Greeks eastward against the ancient enemy, against Persia itself, to avenge the old invasions and to seize the treasures of the great king. But Philip did not live to lead that expedition. At the height of his power, amid the celebrations of a royal wedding, he was struck down by an assassin, and the reasons behind the killing remain shadowed and debated to this day. His great design passed, along with his throne, to his son, a young man of about 20 who had already shown flashes of extraordinary daring. His name was Alexander, and the world would come to call him Alexander the Great. Alexander had been shaped for greatness from his earliest years. His father had given him the finest teacher imaginable, bringing the philosopher Aristotle himself to instruct the boy, so that the future conqueror learned from one of the deepest minds the world has ever known. From his mother, a fierce and forceful woman, he seems to have drawn his burning intensity and his conviction that a destiny beyond the common lot awaited him. He slept, it was said, with a copy of Homer's Iliad beneath his pillow, and he dreamed of matching the heroes of old, of rivaling swift Achilles, of winning a glory that time could never dim. When his father was killed, the young king moved swiftly to secure his throne, putting down revolts and reminding the Greek cities sternly of their submission. Then, with the united strength of Greece and Macedon behind him, he turned his face east and set out to accomplish what his father had only planned. What followed is among the most astonishing stories in all of history, so vast and improbable that it reads almost like legend, and yet it happened. With an army small beside the empire he meant to overthrow, Alexander crossed into Asia and struck at the heart of Persian power. Battle after battle against forces far larger than his own, he won through brilliant generalship, through a personal courage that bordered on recklessness, and through an army the like of which the world had not seen. He defeated the great king's forces at a river crossing, then met the great king himself in a mighty clash and put him to flight. He marched down the coast, taking the great port cities and cutting the Persian fleet off from its harbors, so that command of the sea fell into his hands without a battle upon the water. He turned aside into Egypt, where the people, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a deliverer. And there, near the mouth of the Nile, he founded a city and gave it his own name, Alexandria, a city that would grow into one of the greatest centers of learning the world would ever know. Then he plunged into the very heart of the Persian Empire. On a wide plain he met and broke the last great army the great king could gather, and the vast realm of Persia, which had stood for 2 centuries and had once threatened to swallow Greece whole, fell into his hands. He entered the great Persian capitals and took their treasures, riches beyond counting. The great king fled and was murdered by his own followers, and Alexander, the young ruler from the rough northern land the southern Greeks had once despised, now sat upon the throne of the largest empire the world had yet known, and he was still not yet 30 years old. But Alexander was not a man who could rest, and here we touch the restless mystery at the center of his soul. Having conquered the greatest empire on earth, he did not stop. He pressed onward, ever eastward, into lands the Greeks had scarcely heard of, across deserts and over-towering mountains, through the highlands of Central Asia, and down into the valleys of what we now call Afghanistan and Pakistan. He founded cities as he went, many bearing his own name, planting Greek settlers and Greek ways in the farthest corners of the known world. He married a woman of the eastern lands and began to wear the dress and adopt some of the customs of the peoples he had conquered, dreaming, it seems, of a great mingling of East and West under one rule, a vision that troubled and angered many of his Macedonian followers, who had not marched to the ends of the earth to see their king become an Eastern monarch. At last, deep in the east, on the banks of a distant river beyond the Indus, his weary soldiers refused to go any farther. They had followed him for years across half the world, through countless battles and hardships, and now, far from home, exhausted and heartsick, they would go no more. Alexander, whom no enemy had ever defeated, was defeated at last by the weariness of his own men. Reluctantly, he turned back. The homeward journey became its own ordeal, for he led part of his army through a scorching desert where many perished of thirst and heat, and not long after reaching the heart of his conquered empire, in the ancient city of Babylon beside the Euphrates, Alexander fell ill with a fever and died, still a young man, having conquered more of the world than anyone before him, and having built an empire that stretched from Greece to the borders of India. He left no clear heir, and so his vast empire, held together by nothing but his own genius and will, did not survive him. His generals, hard and ambitious men who had followed him across the world, fell to fighting over the spoils. For decades they warred among themselves, carving the great empire into pieces, until at last it settled into several large kingdoms, each ruled by the descendants of one of Alexander's commanders. There was a kingdom in Egypt, ruled from Alexandria by the line of a general named Ptolemy, which would endure for nearly 300 years and end at last with its famous final queen, Cleopatra. There was a vast realm stretching across Asia, held by the descendants of the general Seleucus. There was Macedon itself, and other kingdoms besides. The unity that Alexander had briefly forged was gone, but something he had set in motion could never be undone. For Alexander's conquests, brief as his own life had been, opened the whole known world to Greek influence in a way that would last for centuries after his empire had crumbled. Historians call the age that followed the Hellenistic age, from the old Greek word for Greece itself, an age in which Greek language, learning, art, and ways of life spread far beyond the small homeland of the city-states, mingling with the ancient cultures of Egypt, of Persia, of the Near East, to create something new and rich and strange. In the cities Alexander and his successors founded, from the Nile to the mountains of Central Asia, Greek became the language of government, of trade, of the educated. A merchant from the shores of Greece could travel to a city in the Far East and find there a theater, a place for exercise and learning, temples to the familiar gods, and people speaking a form of his own tongue. For a time, the Greek world had become a world almost without borders, a great shared civilization spanning 3 continents. And nowhere did this new age shine more brightly than in Alexandria in Egypt, the greatest of the cities that bore Alexander's name. Under the Ptolemies who ruled there, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the world. Its kings built a great institution devoted to learning, a home for scholars and a library that aimed to gather all the knowledge of humankind beneath one roof. To that library came books from every land, copied and collected until the collection numbered, by some accounts, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of many peoples gathered in a single place. Scholars journeyed there from across the world, supported by the kings, free to devote their whole lives to study. In Alexandria, a mathematician named Euclid set down the principles of geometry so clearly and so completely that his work would be studied for more than 2,000 years. There, in that age, thinkers measured the size of the earth with remarkable accuracy, using little more than shadows and reason. And some even dared to suggest, long before it could be proven, that the earth might move around the sun. Physicians studied the human body, engineers devised ingenious machines, and patient scholars preserved and studied the great writings of the past. Let us pause here a moment, in the quiet halls of that great library, for it holds a special place in the memory of the world, a symbol of both the heights the human mind can reach and the fragility of all that we build. Imagine its long rooms lined with shelves of scrolls, the soft rustle of papyrus, scholars bent over their reading in the gentle light, the slow and careful work of copyists preserving the words of the dead so that they might speak to the living. Here was gathered the learning of Greece and Egypt and Babylon and beyond, the poems and the histories, the mathematics and the medicine, the philosophy and the science of many peoples. It was one of the noblest things human beings have ever made, this attempt to save all knowledge from the forgetfulness of time. And like so much that is noble, it did not last. Over the following centuries, through fires and wars and the slow decay of institutions, the great library was lost, its scrolls scattered and destroyed, its treasures gone. We do not know exactly how or when it perished, for the sources are unclear and later writers disagreed, and it seems likely that it faded through many misfortunes across a long span of time, rather than vanishing in a single night. But its loss remains one of the quiet sorrows of history, a reminder of how much of what humanity creates can slip away into darkness, and of how precious and how vulnerable is the keeping of knowledge across the generations. The Hellenistic age changed not only the map of the world, but the way the Greeks thought and felt. In the old days of the independent city-states, a man's whole world had been his polis, and philosophy had asked how the citizen should live within his community. But now the small cities had lost their independence, swallowed into great kingdoms ruled by distant kings, and the ordinary person could no longer feel that he shaped the fate of his world through his vote and his voice. The world had grown vast and impersonal, and people sought new ways to find peace within it. And so new schools of philosophy arose that spoke less of the city and more of the individual soul, of how to find tranquility and contentment in a world one could not control. Some taught that happiness lay in the quiet pleasures of friendship and simple living, in freedom from fear and pain, in withdrawing from the storms of public life into a garden of the mind. Others, the followers of a philosophy we call Stoicism, taught that we cannot control what happens to us, but we can always control how we respond, that virtue and inner strength are the only true goods, that we should accept with calm what we cannot change and find our freedom in the mastery of our own souls. This Stoic wisdom, born in an uncertain age, would spread far and comfort many, and its quiet counsel still speaks to troubled hearts today. And so the story moves gently onward, and we come to the last great turning of our long tale. For while the Greek kingdoms of the east grew rich and learned and quarreled among themselves, far to the west, on the banks of a river in Italy, another city had been slowly and patiently building a power that would one day gather the whole Greek world, and much else besides, into its embrace. That city was Rome. The full story of Rome is one for another night, but we cannot close the story of ancient Greece without it, for the two are forever bound together. The Romans were a practical, disciplined, land-loving people who had spread their control across Italy through a mixture of war and shrewd alliance, and who now began to reach outward into the wider sea. In the west, they fought long and terrible wars against the great trading city of Carthage, and in the east they were drawn, step by step, into the endless quarrels of the Greek kingdoms, called in first as allies, then as arbiters, and at last as masters. The Greek kingdoms, weakened by their divisions and no match for the relentless strength of Rome, fell one by one. Macedon was conquered. The old Greek leagues were crushed. In a moment the Greeks would long remember with bitterness. The ancient and wealthy city of Corinth was destroyed as a warning to any who might dare to resist. And so Greece, the land that had turned back the Persians and conquered the east under Alexander, became a province of Rome, ruled from a city that in the days of Pericles had been little more than a rough town on a distant river. Yet here is the great and beautiful paradox with which our story closes, the quiet triumph hidden inside the defeat. Greece lost its freedom to Rome, but in a deeper sense Greece conquered Rome. For the Romans, though they had beaten the Greeks in war, fell utterly in love with Greek culture. A Roman poet, looking back on it all, would famously say that captive Greece had taken her fierce conqueror captive. The Romans learned the Greek language, read Greek books, admired Greek art, copied Greek statues, and sent their sons to study philosophy in Athens. They took the Greek gods and gave them Roman names. They built their temples in the Greek manner, wrote their poetry after Greek models, and shaped their own thought by the light of Greek philosophy. Everything the Greeks had created, their art and their drama, their history and their philosophy, their mathematics and their science, their very way of asking questions about the world, all of it flowed into Rome, and through Rome into the whole of the civilization that came after, carried across the centuries to us. And so the ideas born on those rocky hills and narrow shores never truly died. They passed from Greece to Rome, and when the Roman world in the West at last sank into its own long twilight, they were kept alive in the Eastern Roman lands, and in quiet monasteries where patient monks copied the old manuscripts by candlelight, and among distant scholars who treasured and studied the works of Aristotle and the other Greek masters. Long centuries later, when Europe reawakened to learning, it was to the Greeks that it returned, rediscovering their philosophy, their art, their science, their vision of what human beings might become. The Greek questions became the world's questions. The Greek word democracy names the way many nations now choose to govern themselves. The Greek habit of looking at the world and asking why, of seeking natural causes and reasoned explanations, lies at the root of all that we now call science. The Greek plays are still performed, the Greek statues still admired, the Greek myths still told to children at bedtime. That old man sitting in his doorway long ago, watching the stars come out over the Acropolis, could never have known it. But the world he half feared was ending would in truth never end at all. It would only change its shape and travel onward and become part of everything that followed. Before we let the night close fully around this ancient world, let us return once more to the ordinary people who lived beneath these great events. For so much of the true story of Greece was lived not on the battlefield or in the assembly, but in the quiet rooms of houses, in the narrow streets, in the fields at dawn and the harbors at dusk. History remembers the kings and the generals, the philosophers and the poets. But for every one of these there were thousands upon thousands of nameless people, whose days were filled with work and worry, with small joys and small sorrows, and whose lives were the true fabric of the Greek world. A Greek house, even a comfortable one, was a modest thing, built of sun-dried brick on a foundation of stone, its rooms small, arranged around an open central courtyard where the life of the household gathered. Light came from small windows and from little oil lamps of clay or bronze, which burned olive oil with a soft and steady golden flame, filling the rooms with a gentle glow as darkness fell. When night came, the household drew close around these small flames, and beyond their circle the rooms sank into shadow, for there were no lamps in the streets, only the moon and the stars, and here and there the flicker of light behind a shuttered window. The rhythm of the day began early, with the first gray light. In the countryside, where most Greeks lived, the farmer rose with the dawn and went out to his land, to the olive groves and the vines and the small fields of barley and wheat. Farming in Greece was hard and patient work, for the soil was thin and the summers dry, and everything depended on the timely coming of the winter rains. The olive was the treasure of the land, its trees living for generations, its oil used for food, for light, for cleaning the body, so that the loss of an olive grove in war was a wound that took a lifetime to heal. The grape gave wine, which the Greeks drank at every meal, always mixed with water. Grain gave bread and porridge, the foundation of every table. Meat was eaten mainly at festivals, when animals were sacrificed to the gods and the flesh shared among the people, so that a religious feast was also one of the few times ordinary folk tasted roasted meat. Otherwise, the table held bread and olives, cheese and figs, vegetables and the fish that the ever-present sea provided. It was a plain fare, but a healthy one, and it sustained a people of remarkable energy. Within the household moved the quiet and largely hidden life of women, who in much of the Greek world managed the home, raised the children, and above all worked wool into cloth, for the making of clothing was the great and constant labor of women's hands. To spin thread from raw wool, and to weave it into cloth upon the tall upright loom was the mark of a good and industrious wife, and the clothing of the whole family came from her patient work. We should be honest that the Greek world, for all its glories, gave women little public voice and confined them narrowly, and that this too is part of the truth we must hold alongside our admiration. Yet within the home the woman was mistress of a whole small kingdom, and in the plays and the poems, in the myths of powerful goddesses and formidable heroines, we catch glimpses of how deeply the Greeks felt the strength and significance of women, even in a world that gave them so little room. Children grew up quickly and were treasured, though childhood was fragile, for many little ones died, young of sicknesses no medicine of that age could cure. Those who survived played with simple toys, and in a city like Athens, learned to read and write and count, to sing and to recite the poems of Homer, which they learned by heart, so that the words of the ancient epics were woven into their minds from their earliest years. The public life of the city moved through the marketplace, the aura, which was the beating heart of the community. Here in the open air, the life of the city gathered itself. In the early morning, the market filled with buyers and sellers, farmers bringing produce from the countryside, fishermen with the night's catch, potters and metal workers displaying their wares, merchants with goods carried across the sea. The air was full of noise and smell, the calling of vendors, the ring of coins, the mingled scents of fish and bread and humanity pressed together. And the agora was far more than a market. It was where men met to talk, to share news, to argue politics, to carry on the business of the courts and the government. It was where Socrates once wandered, stopping his fellow citizens with his patient and unsettling questions. It was where the affairs of the city were carried on in a swirl of conversation and commerce, and the constant, restless exchange of ideas that made the Greek city so alive. And always, running through the whole of Greek life like a bright thread, there was the sea. The Greeks were a maritime people, and their ships bound their scattered world together. Picture the harbor of a Greek city at evening, the fishing boats coming in with the day's catch, the merchant ships riding at anchor with cargoes from distant shores, the swift war galleys drawn up on the beach. To sail the ancient sea was to face real danger, for storms could rise suddenly and wreck a ship far from any help, and the deep took many lives each year, so that the sailor lived always with the nearness of death and prayed earnestly to the powers of the water. Yet the sea was also the great road of opportunity, the path to wealth and adventure and new lands, and the Greeks embraced it with a boldness that carried them and their culture to the farthest shores of the known world. When night fell over the islands and the stars wheeled overhead, the Greek sailor navigated by those same stars as his ancestors had done, feeling himself small beneath the vast sky and the vaster sea, one brief life upon the ancient waters. And so we come, at the last, to the quiet close of our long journey. We have traveled a great distance tonight, from the first farmers on the rocky hills, through the age of heroes and the coming of writing, through the birth of the city-states and the great struggle against Persia, through the Golden Age of Athens and its fall, through the conquests of Alexander that carried Greek ways to the ends of the earth, through the age of great kingdoms and great libraries, and at last to the coming of Rome and the strange victory by which conquered Greece conquered its conqueror. It is a long and crowded story, full of striving and suffering, of beauty and loss, of the endless human effort to build something lasting in a world where nothing lasts. And through it all runs that quiet thread of meaning, the sense that these people in their brief and troubled lives reached toward something that outlived them and passed it on to us. Think one last time of that world as the night comes down upon it. The lamps are being lit in the small houses, the little golden flames blooming one by one in the gathering dark. The last ships are coming into harbor, their day's work done, and the sailors are making them fast for the night. In the marketplace, the crowds have thinned and gone home, and the great empty space lies quiet beneath the first stars. On the high rock above the city, the temples stand dark and serene, keeping their long watch over the sleeping town as they have done for generations. A mother sings softly to a child. An old man sits in his doorway remembering, and over it all the great night sky wheels slowly. The same stars that guided the ships and marked the seasons and looked down upon Homer and Socrates and Alexander, the same stars that look down upon us now. They are all gone now. Those people gone into the long silence of the past. Their voices stilled, their days ended, their names in most cases lost forever. The cities they built are ruins, the empires they raised are dust, the fleets they launched lie deep beneath the sea. And yet, in the strange and gentle way of these things, they are not wholly gone. They live on in every question we ask about the world, in every reaching toward beauty and truth and justice, in the very words and thoughts we use without knowing where they came from. The light they lit so long ago, on those rocky shores beside that bright and ancient sea, was never truly put out. It was only passed on, hand to hand, across the centuries, and it burns, softly, still. So let them rest now, the Greeks of long ago, and let their world sink gently into the peace of the past. Let the temples stand silent on their hills beneath the stars. Let the sea grow calm and dark. Let the last lamp in the last house flicker and go out, and let the night come down, soft and complete, over that old and beautiful world. Their work is done, and it was good, and it endures. And there is nothing left for us to do tonight but to rest, as they are resting, and to let the quiet gather around us, and to carry the memory of that far shining sea gently down with us into sleep.